one name for him is the great mediator, and that's exactly what he is here. He's a mediator between the gatekeepers and the common person.
Or he gets rid of him.
Yeah.
Thales kind of had the same thing. We're not the student's job is to find out if the teacher knows what he's talking about. It's not just to listen to the teacher; it's to challenge the teacher.
Humility is something that I think is almost for people, for us, for a being that can reflect on their own actions. It can behave almost like a force in and of itself, because it gives you the ability to gain knowledge. Without humility, one thing I like to say is the first step to learning anything is admitting your ignorance to it. Without the ability to admit ignorance, which is humility, you learn nothing. You only become more married to improper or bad methods. And that's basically what Christ is. So that's like a super force kind of that we have if we apply it, because we know that not everyone will, based off of our repeated experiences. We know that people marry their bad ideas over time. So if you're able to just procure humility over and over and over again, and that's something that Christ is going to talk about with those ghettos, then you're able to not just gain quick knowledge, but continue to gain knowledge. And that's something the Bible talks about over and over, is that wisdom gain versus the intellectual kind of world.
You mentioned how Christ appealed to the homeless and the prostitutes. In the same way, Thales' insight means anyone can be a student. Anyone can reach that state.
Yeah.
If you're open to that reality, it will come in. Well, this is my whole idea. There's a downside to this idea. That the Christian virtues are what made Christians powerful, because they're good for business, because they create a learning state above and beyond the confidence that comes from being a well-loved neighbor and secure in your salvation. You're going to come off as a pretty mellow, easygoing person if you have that attitude, whether you believe in the supernatural or not. But there's a downside to this. The downside is, right?
Yeah.
So Yahweh said, you gotta follow my laws, or you lose my favor and suffer, right?
What's that?
Yahweh said you gotta follow my laws or suffer, right?
To a certain extent. That would be a larger discussion. I wouldn't say that that's I would say that that's the common understanding of it. I don't believe that that's the way it should have been interpreted from the beginning. But yes, that's the common understanding of it. My interpretation of it, just to sum up, is that follow my laws so you don't suffer.
Nice. All right. Well, that I think is your Christian projection back in time. What happens to Christians who don't follow the virtues?
They do end up suffering, predictably.
Well, let's see. What's the opposite? What were the three again? We got deception.
Yeah. So if you're not honest, you're going to be deceptive or fraudulent. If you're not humble, you're going to be prideful, marry bad ideas. And if you're not of charity, of service, you're going to be of abundance or fat or just.
Well, but if we're going with charity, meaning you assume the best in people, what's the opposite of that?
You assume the worst, yeah. And I always do the metaphoric talk. But yeah, that's exactly you're exactly right. You effectively you're cynical. You everything, and honestly, those two. So deception. A lot of times you deceive yourself if you're not honest. But worse, those last two, proud and cynical, those go together like the ugliest marriage in the world. Cynical. If you're prideful, you are guaranteed to be cynical, because anybody who comes against you with a different concept, you're going to assume the worst of.
So yeah, if you're going to show up here and tell me I don't have a right to be proud, you must be some kind of dick.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
If you're some kind of dick, I'm not going to really want to be interacting with you or talking.
Yeah, and that's where you find people who have had lifelong relationships. All of a sudden, that's just severed, and a lot of times, one of those people have fallen into the self-deceptive trap of proud cynicism.
We call these people hypocrites, and you probably know as well as I do. There's way too many of them out there. When we talk about the weakening of Christianity, because there's a lot less Christians than there were 20 years ago.
Yeah. So this is I love this discussion. I think the best way to ever explain this in a simple terms to people is any good idea will be manipulated, and any good idea will have people who are good but bad at competency or bad at application adopt it. Like, you have a lot of really bad technology people who have Apple phones because they're bad at technology, right? And so they're going to even fuck up that Apple phone over and over again more than you will. But that's not because they're not someone who's trying. It's just they're really bad at it. And the problem is, you don't judge the Apple phone off of the shitty users of the Apple phone, the shitty appliers of it. You judge the Apple phone over the functionality when it is applied in the proper way. And that's where a lot of people miss, in my opinion, the message. They judge and it happens in politics too. It's not just in Christianity, but they judge the Christianity off of the application of its worst participants instead of the application of the best. Now, if you were to apply the same to other religions, such as, and I don't want to get into a debate on best religions, but like, for example, people who apply Islam to what they interpret to be the best Islam interpretation can be very fatal. People who interpret Christ to the best Christ interpretation is nothing but grace and love. That is all it is. And so that's where there's a very, very big distinction there. And you don't judge the Apple phone user or the Android user off of the worst applier of the phone. It's how does the phone function if you have Steve Jobs on stage or Tim Cook, doing a run through on it? How's it function? That's what everyone judges it. They have huge things to judge it off of that. But you never get that with Christianity.
That's a common groupthink thing. Let's suppose when I think about judging traditions, it seems to me the way to judge it is to try it.
Yeah.
Should we adopt a tradition before we can fairly judge it? And that's kind of a loaded question. I'm not going to try and answer that right now. But at some level, when we talk about the worst players versus the best players, the real question is what kind of if we're talking about rule sets, because that's what morality means, right? There's all these different rule sets. How do you judge a rule set without playing the game for a while?
Yeah.
And of course, the problem with the supernatural stuff is there's no take backs. There's no second chances.
Well, you have to have a fundamental law of humanity, of people being just generally, you're living and I'm living, so I'm not going to take your life and you're not going to take my life. And then after that, all moral laws can be built. But if you don't have that first moral law of that, and no matter what laws exist in any country or any religion, there's people who live and don't live by that moral law. If I see you and you're standing there, I see another human being who is worthy of life, no matter how shitty I think you might be. Despite that shittiness, you're still worthy of life. There's that moral component that unless you take life, you are worthy of life. And unless you have that at the bare bones, you don't have a morality. Everything can be built off that, in my opinion, but you must have that first.
You're talking about reciprocity.
I don't.
Reciprocity. Did I spell that right? I don't think I did.
I don't know because I don't know what it means.
It means giving back what you were given.
Gotcha.
If you're killing people, you can't expect to not get some pushback, right? If you're cheating people, you're going to get ripped off. If you're lying, people aren't going to trust you. They're not going to tell you stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Then exactly. Yeah, if you don't have that, I'm going to botch this, but reciprocity.
Reciprocity.
Yeah, if you don't have that, and I actually say that when I've gotten into some conflict with family members and whatnot in the past, and I've had to remind them the way they approached me when they had concerns. I'm like, you've approached me, put your finger in my chest and said my middle name because you said you loved me. I'm doing it to you now, and you're going to sit here and bitch about it? And that's exactly it. It's that moral law of having that reciprocal relationship where, hey, if I feel it's a worthy thing to do because of this, then it's okay for it to be done to me because of this.
And what does humble pie mean? It means eating your own BS.
Exactly. Yep.
You're painting yourself into this corner. Why is it my problem?
Yep. Exactly.
So when we talked earlier about having this discussion, we kind of brushed on Thomas Sowell's description of different moral systems. We've already been going 40 minutes. I think we should save that for another time.
Oh yeah, good call. Yeah.
Especially if we want to do an unpack.
Well, let me. I'll unpack. Now I'll summarize, I guess, my component of why I think the Christ revolution is the moral revolution, and it has to do with being inside of the system, rebuking the system, and providing a new moral component to that system from within it. And then one step beyond that, this is a little bit different, but when you think about forces within the world, Christ was really speaking to light and reflectivity. And when you look at just physics, and then when you look at your own self, so quantum physics and then regular laws of physics, you see a lot of reflectiveness in nature. You see a lot of where it's almost like you see a lot of light only being able to be seen in the water. You see a lot of that happening in nature, and Christ spoke a lot about that. And so his insights on the level from within the system while rebuking it, and then the relationship between what he preached and what ended up being not just in the best moral systems, but in physics, to me says that it was following that path was the most likely scenario to a moral structure being crafted. I think he was the foundation of moral structure. Without grace and humility and servitude, you don't have a moral structure to be built upon, kind of.
Well, hold on a second. I started off using moral in a really specific way, meaning moral standards of judgment. I think you're talking about ethical standards. I think it's a slightly different use of moral here.
Perhaps. I might not be explaining it the right way.
Am I right that I sort of captured the kernel of that? That it's really the individual.
Yes, that's the key.
Not systems.
Yeah, people over systems. Up until that point, you had to go to the prayer. You had to get to the holy tent, and only certain people could talk to God. This was a pathway to an individual relationship, individually versus systems.
There's other. That's interesting because there's a conflict that I see over the years, over the centuries. When you talk about people being greater than systems, what about some of these pagan rituals?
Oh, yeah.
And the reason I mention that is because, Christ obviously did not worry about, for example, prayer wheels. Right?
Yeah. So I have a great line for what I think you're getting at. If you find yourself inside of traditional Christian structures or just pagan structures or just any structure in general, look at the Bible, because it was typically someone from outside that structure who had been called up, like Moses had been rebuked and sent to the desert, and he was, and the Egyptian war. David stepped up. They became faithful. They were close to God, but they were nowhere near it wasn't a preacher on a pulpit all of a sudden. If anything, John the Baptist was the closest to that, but he's a guy in the lake. So that's one of those things I think you might be getting at, where I think a lot of people who fall into this ritual cycle, prayer wheels and whatnot, they miss the story God's telling around the Bible. That's the biggest part that people need to think about. If you're going to believe the Bible, then you have to believe that God's telling a story around the story. You have to read the story God is saying. That's why we're vessels. That's how you're able to remove the name of Paul and the name of Kanye and say a guy who got knocked off of his mobile, his device he was traveling on, so a donkey in a car, and then proclaimed that Jesus walked and then had a conversion. So that's how you're able to do that, because you do this vessel approach, and then you're able to read the story that God is trying to tell around the people walking. Anyway.
You said we are vessels. That's the big insight in the Buddhist tradition that's known as the greater journey. When we realize on multiple levels, just like we're a food tube, right? The material that goes to make up your life in total is several 100,000 tons. If you add up all the air you've ever breathed, and all the water you ever drank, and all the food you ever ate, not to even talk about when you go for a boat ride or an airplane ride, that's also part of your life. But again, we're at 45 minutes now. So.
You're right. Yeah, my bad. I started going off that. Let's do the unpack.
All right. So for next time, we'll continue exploring this and maybe talk about the redneck moral system.
Yeah, we'll hit that. We'll hit Thomas Sowell. We'll hit that, and that'll really drive this into focus, I think, when we do that on our next one.